Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Bobby Sura. I'm a clinical psychologist and director at Solihull Wellbeing Clinic. Thank you for joining this live stream where I'm going to be talking with David Crisp. David has a lot of experience with autism, and that is going to be the subject of our conversations together. So many of you may have seen the advertisement for tonight's session. A live stream with David Crisp. David is a CPD accredited autism speaker and trainer. He's got 13 years of experience in health and social care, mostly in the field of autism. And at the age of 42 years, David was actually diagnosed with autism himself. So quite an interesting story. And also his children, I'm sure he won't mind me saying, because he speaks about this in his online blogs and so on, that they were also diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum as adults. So David has a lot of professional and personal experience to bring to this subject. So let's get going. Hi, David. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you absolutely fine, David. Yes, thank you for coming back by popular demand.
Yeah, got all the bugs out of the system. It's a bit like I'm a Celebrity with the wrong sort of bugs, though, wasn't
it? That's right, David. That's right. So, David, autism, some people don't like to call it a disorder. There's something about autism where people now use the term neurodiversity and neurodiverse. What's your thinking about that? Are you more leaning towards that sort of way of describing it?
Well, I think that's the way it's going. I mean, I identify as autistic. I've never really been a great fan of the term Aspergers syndrome, which I was originally diagnosed with, mainly because it implies that someone has mild autism. Well, people that I've met, some of them with Aspergers syndrome, as a diagnosis have, whilst on the face of it, they may have mild autism, may have a lot of mental health issues. So it's easy to think, well, their life's cushy compared to someone maybe with the old term Canner's classic autism, that they may not have those mental health issues. So for some people, having a learning disability is part of their presentation. For other people, they may not have a learning disability, but they're disabled by society, not necessarily socially disabled themselves. So it's how society perceives them, which can cause, if you've got the awareness that you are wired differently, lots of issues with employment, education, friendships, relationships, and all those sort of issues. So you can perhaps have, in many ways, more issues than maybe someone that's the older, more classical end of autism. Mm-hmm. So it's not quite as clear cut as it thinks, So I think that's why I think the neurodivergent is a good way of describing it. And also, if you don't want to use the autism word because people may prejudge you on it, neurodiversity gets around that. It's a bit like ethnicity. To say from an ethnic origin, that's sufficient for some people, rather than having to go into great details. And then they may, if you're from India, they may use derogatory terms thinking you're from Pakistan, and I know the two nations don't always get on, so that can cause conflicts in itself with that. So sometimes, but I know this week on LinkedIn, I've been a little bit annoyed that some people are so obsessed with the terminology, and I think it's more important we get the acceptance out there and fight against the abuses and deliberate and indeliberate, and when it comes to society and education, employment, etc., then maybe spend so much time on terminology, because terminology, as you're aware, as in medicine or as a clinical psychologist, changes. As society moves on, as science moves on, what's neurodiversity now, in 10 years' time, it may have the same meaning but a totally different word that comes up. So so it's, to me, it's a useful term, but it shouldn't. Those endless arguments, I think, sometimes can muddy the water if you're collectively trying to improve the lives of people that are autistic. So I think sometimes it can get in the way, although I appreciate exactly where they're coming from as an autistic myself.
Yes, and of course, there's also the issue, isn't there, David? Some people still refer to Asperger's syndrome as another description, or Aspies, and
Yeah,
again, you can get lost in the language. But for some people, that's their preference. Although we know from a diagnostic point of view that term's now been subsumed under autism spectrum. Um,
yeah,
so
precisely.
yeah, so I think you're right. It's having a kind of balanced sort of sense of these things, isn't it? Mm,
It is, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, David, in terms of there may be people tuning in today, or will follow this stream over the coming weeks and months, maybe even years, because once something is on the internet, it stays, doesn't it? Unless it's taken down.
Yeah.
Um, but if we were to really boil it down for people who are perhaps very new to the field, maybe worried about someone in their family or themselves having autism, um, what is it that we're looking for? Because you are a autism trainer, you've also been an autism needs assessor, you've worked with the National Autistic Society, so I know you bring a lot of experience to the field.
Yeah.
But if we were to sort of, in simple terms, explain uh, what it broadly means if you have a diagnosis or may get a diagnosis of autism, what are we
Yeah,
looking at?
well, for me, it's you can you can use terms like different way of being, but most people maybe find that quite a difficult concept to grasp. But I prefer it as you're having a different processing system. At the
Mm,
moment, as you know, we've had a few technical issues this tonight, and we had several a few weeks ago. But
mm,
I'm using a Microsoft computer. You may be using an Apple Mac. Not that it matters. But these are two systems that are incompatible software-wise, but one
mm,
isn't necessarily better than the other. And it's the same with people that are autistic. We're wired differently, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're better or worse than somebody else that isn't autistic or isn't neurodivergent. It's just a different way of thinking.
mhm.
Which is why I call my company Wired for Autism, because we're
Yeah.
wired differently. It's a different way of thinking as well as a different way of being. So that certain concepts may take us longer to grasp, and others we can get quicker than other people because we don't get muddled down with some of the periphery of things. So
Mm,
it can be swings and roundabouts sometimes. That's a way of describing it. Sometimes we can concentrate on the detail and miss the bigger picture, and other times we see the bigger picture and miss the detail, depending on how we individually present or in individual circumstances or environment. So so really we've got to be diagnosed, you have to have deficits in three areas, which are social imagination. Social communication and interaction, and we
mhm.
have repetitive and restrictive activities,
Yes.
and we also have a sensory profile as well. So years ago, it
Mm,
used to be three things: the three social imagination, social communication, and social interaction. But the
mm.
social
The trial.
imagination sort of went out the window because people were thinking, well, you can't be autistic because you've got an imagination, but they weren't
Mhm.
thinking about that. It was more how you understand socially what someone's trying to communicate to you,
Yes.
and understand that your actions and words impact on another and vice versa. So it's
Mm,
trying to get, the hardest thing autistic people have to do, unless they go into psychology in great detail, is understanding how somebody else thinks. They may
right.
understand another autistic person thinking, the logical thinking, and the way of eliminating all the fluff that we have in a conversation.
Mm,
But to other people, that's a necessary part of communicating. We tend to be more, again, it's generalization, more task orientated, more logical thinkers. And anything that gets in the way of that logic can sometimes be quite difficult for us. But
mhm.
then again, there are people like myself that, yes, I'm a logical thinker. He can be quite emotional, and some people are autistic. I find it really difficult in either showing emotion or appearing emotional,
Yes.
because they can't control those feelings in themselves, let alone understand somebody else. So they can come across as quite cold and distant. Well, it's really, I can't understand your emotions because I'm struggling to understand my own. It's too,
Yes.
it's a bit like the old adage: you have to love yourself in order to love somebody else. And there's very much that when it comes to the emotional side of autism as well, and that can be very, very difficult for people. So we can come across as self-centered rather than selfish, if that makes sense. That we're having to deal with so much of the things that are going on in our head and in our bodies that it's difficult then to take on somebody else's concerns. And it doesn't mean we don't care. It's just an extra load that's just sometimes too overbearing. Whereas a selfish person just doesn't care. And it's not about not caring. It's about we can only take on so much of somebody else's baggage on top of our own, if that makes sense. It's just too much.
Is that, David, because of the sensory sensitivities and perhaps the environment that we may see, where I'm sitting now, bright light shining, there's
precisely. I mean, if you imagine yourself that you're not autistic, but you're I like to think in some ways autistic. It's kind of like you're living like a foreigner in a strange land. You may have the same intellect as somebody else, but you don't understand everything that they're trying to say to you. You might get them, as my daughter calls them, the wow words out of the conversation, the important bits, but the rest of it disappears. It's kind of like I have very limited knowledge of French. I could watch a French film with French subtitles as well, and I'd pick out the odd word. I know what that means, but without the subtitles, I wouldn't have a clue what half of what they're saying. But I might be able to get the gist of it, but not the whole picture. And sometimes with autistic people, it can be very much like that. So it's not necessarily anything to do with intellect. It's about understanding what someone's communicating with you and how you communicate back to them. And sometimes you may hear a sentence, but only 2 or 3 words of that sentence jump out to you. And then you have to compute what's the relevance of what they're trying to say. What are the most important words in that sentence? And it could be totally wrong. On simple terms, if you want to get an autistic person's attention, say their name first rather than at the end of a sentence, because they immediately know that you're talking to them and not generally talking to anybody in the room. You're getting their attention first, rather than at the end of the conversation when they might talk. And it works with anybody, but particularly autistic people. It's a good strategy. So it's those sort of things which we find very difficult, and of course. It's a term I use, but I'm not sure if it's politically correct in the autistic world. But I say that when you're stressed or anxious, you become, for want of a better word, more autistic. You become more anxious, which increases your sensory sensitivity and your emotional upheaval that's going on and everything. So the environment becomes disabling. So when I say we're not necessarily disabled, the environment can be quite disabling in certain circumstances. And likewise, if you're having to interpret information that's coming in through your ears, then your ability to listen is very much slowed down and very much impaired. So even though we can hear perfectly well, if all you're hearing is in effect like white noise, it's very then difficult to actually pick out the important parts of what someone's trying to tell you, because you're still computing on the first point by the 1.3. So it can be quite complicated. But even people that I've worked with that are severe, that have a learning disability, or sometimes a severe learning disability and autism, they can still learn and develop. It may take longer. Even things like puberty, they might not show the signs of puberty physically or and certainly not socially and relationship-wise until they're much later, like the 20s or whatever, rather than the teenage years. So a lot of things in life they will catch up on it just a little bit longer, or they'll go from not understanding 1 minute to understanding the whole picture. It's kind of like no one ever explained to me the rules of tennis, for example. I've picked that up just by watching it a lot. And with football, my brother spent years trying to explain the offside rule, and then one day, just watching telly on my own, I got it. Nobody explaining it to me. It just made sense. But the amount of times I've been told it, the last man standing, all this sort of, I needed to see it enough time to get the picture of what they're actually trying to say before I actually understand it. I probably still couldn't necessarily explain it to somebody else, but because I'm not that keen a football person, but I couldn't understand. You get there, and likewise, those that are autistic and have delay in speech, like my daughter, for example,
Mm.
They may never babble, and they present as deaf, and then suddenly when they do, if they do learn to speak, go from nothing to complete sentences rather than a gradual thing. It's kind of like the brain will figure out a way to get there. So instead of
Yes.
being A to B, it can be A, B, C, A, C, D, E, F, and then, whoa, well, back to B. So you get there eventually, but it's a long way around. It's like it takes goes around, and I was not say it takes a bypass, but normally a quicker route, but the opposite of a bypass, like a detour, then eventually gets that point.
I understand. So, David, in terms of you getting this diagnosis in your 40s, was that, some people say that having the diagnosis is a great relief because it starts to help to make sense of how you've
Yeah,
experienced the world. And was that the case for you? Was it quite important?
yeah. I was a late developer when it came to relationships with girlfriends, etc.,
Mm,
and things like that, and other relationships. But more than ever, I had quite a few years of depression.
mm,
And I was brought up, for example, to learn that hard work is its own reward, and I went to work to work, simply as that, rather than the social aspect of it. But
mm,
post-diagnosis, I understood that, yeah, there's another element to it. You have to try and sometimes, even with the people that you don't like, you've got to try and get on with people at work, and realise that work isn't just simply doing the job. Because yes, you may, even it's kind of like, it's more than just going to work, because otherwise you're going to be a social pariah at work. Oh, he's great for getting the work done. We can give him extra work, he'll do it.
yeah,
But you're not going to get invited to social events, whether you want to or not, and you're not going to get on in life and that employment
right,
if they just see
right,
you as a worker and nothing else. You almost have to mask and act out certain behaviours in order to be accepted by the community. You shouldn't have to, but you do. And once you've
right,
got that diagnosis, you understand why you've had these difficulties, and that there isn't necessarily anything wrong with you at all. It's just, why am I like this? Why am I when I was diagnosed, I was actually married and got kids, but why was it in my 20s before I left home? Why was it in my late 20s before I had a serious girlfriend, rather than the sort of thing you usually have maybe 6, 7 years early? Why was I so late at certain things? And then you know
yes,
why, because
yes,
even though you're mature in some ways, socially you were still quite immature. You got you got reached these milestones later. Doesn't mean
yes,
necessarily there's anything wrong in it, but society
mm,
views you like that. Particularly now as we're um, becoming a more obsessed with certain behaviours, like
mm,
uh, like more obsessed with sex, maybe than courting. And again, with me, it was very different as well, because I was the youngest of a large family. So
mm-hmm,
my dad was 50 years old, so I also had quite a traditional sort of background. The music I
right,
grew up to was 50s, 60s, and earlier music. So even with that respect, my environment played a huge part in my development, as well as just the autism. If that makes
yeah,
sense as well. So you become both your environment and both your genes all play a large part in how you present, particularly if you're autistic as well.
mm, yes, yes. And David, your children, did they receive their diagnosis as adults as well, or was it in their childhoods?
As children, my son was diagnosed the later the same year as me. He's always been, he was diagnosed quite early on with having dyspraxia, which is
Mm,
not autism, but very often linked to it. You've got some behavioural difficulties. We've got that, what used to be called in my day, so in my age, clumsy child syndrome. It's not totally NPC description, but he used to fall over a lot and things like that. But he was very, very academic, but socially he had difficulties making friends, unless they got the same interests as him. But he found it very, very difficult to widen that circle,
yeah.
unless they were what we call these geeky or nerdy. Then they're just well on his radar.
Mm-hmm,
So he was diagnosed the same year as myself, as the old term Asperger syndrome.
okay.
My daughter, even though she presented very, very early on, even as a baby, she presented as deaf, and they were doing tests when she was under a year old. Um,
Mm,
she just shocked. She turned up at the cop because you were calling. She feel back in shock, didn't know you were there, and we thought, oh, it's because she not heard us coming. It wasn't that. It's like suddenly she was in her own sort of world, and suddenly Dad appears. And it's like, well, where did he come from? So, but with her, because she had other comorbid conditions, it was later. She had lots of fringe diagnoses, which together made autism. It's kind of like when she was diagnosed, Dr. Judith Gould at the Lorna Ring Centre in Bromley in Kent, at the National Autistic Society, she said what they failed to recognise, some of the doctors locally, is that if something's got webbed feet, waterproof feathers, quacks, waddles a bit, flies, and likes water, it's probably a duck.
Yes.
It's kind of, so in effect, she got all the symptoms, but they didn't put all those. If you think of medicine or psychology as a puzzle, all the pieces were there. They just didn't put all those together, and it was shouting to her, shouting, and it's like, whoa, that nobody else could see it, and there were other reasons as well, but we're not going into that tonight. But there was lots of other issues. Was it because of father's depression, why their behaviour set? Why was it because of my diagnosis that it was impact on the children? So they behaved autistic because the dad was autistic. There's lots of issues that can come to play because of that. So it made it quite difficult. So she was 15 and a half, my daughter, when she was diagnosed.
15 and a half. And David, in terms of men and women, male and female, boys and girls, presenting differently. I mean, obviously, every person on the autism spectrum is unique. They're each different to one another. But is there some truth that girls are harder to diagnose or tend to get a diagnosis less frequently?
Generally, yes. Again, there are, in anything, there's rules. So if you get a disruptive child, boy or girl in class, and they're showing autism signs, then they're more likely to be diagnosed because they're disrupting everybody else's education as well as their own. But if they're studious, sitting at the back, getting on with the work, either they're very intelligent, in which case they might stand out, or they're middle of the road sort of student, they're not, I'll describe it, it's not sinking, but not swimming either, just floating, gradually getting nearer and nearer to the bank, but they're going to get there in their own time. Then that's sort of my daughter, and with her, the school just couldn't get it until she went to a different school. But at home we had biting the dog at the moment she come home. She'd bite a brother when he came home. She would rip up a uniform. She'd scream, shout, bite, kick. She'd destroy a school book, or she had homework to do. She spent 4 hours writing 2 or 3 sentences when she was about 5 or 6 years old, because it had to be perfect. Any slight error, if the letters weren't exactly right, and again, can be an autistic trait. So, but because the school didn't see that, they saw this girl with a fixed grin on her face. Whereas, as you would know through psychology, a smile doesn't necessarily mean happy. It can be a grimace, or it can almost. There is such a thing as a psychotic smile. You can even get a smile that actually says, "I'm actually going to do some damage." But for her, it's very much like, like a young boy being photographed, and he doesn't really want to do it. He pulls a funny face. But for her, she couldn't really smile naturally. She can now, but it's kind of like. And then she's stringing her legs when she's in school, and I was saying, "Isn't that happy, content girl?" We're thinking, yeah, but they didn't quite figure out that part of growing up as a young child is to talk to your friends in class. No, you're not supposed to be a little bit disruptive, be a bit questioning of the teacher. She did none of that, and these are the things that would. And equally, one early sign we had, which was after, not before she got diagnosed, but after we'd had some issues with schools not agreeing, not identifying their concerns, is that she was interviewed. The school had the local radio came to the school, and she was looking at ants and ladybirds, and actually recorded it. And she must have spent 5 or 10 minutes talking about ladybirds to this reporter from local BBC radio.
Right.
And afterwards, and when it's played back, you think, yeah, it sounds really good, but she had got no idea about ladybirds. She came across as this expert, and it was all top of their head. But it's and if you heard her, she would sound like these little bugs are her friends. These are all sort of, she'd name them all sort of thing. You're thinking, this is not the sort of behaviour you expect from a child of 10 or 11 years old. It's
yes.
childish, if you know what I mean, as well as being. But as a result of that, though, we ended up going to the radio station, paid for the children and us and myself and the wife to go to the cinema for free and do a film review, which was quite nice. So it was quite good. But it was really, really sort of interesting how to a complete stranger she was able to open up, but some of the teachers she really found it difficult to talk to. It was quite bizarre. But she's talking
Right.
about things rather than people. You see, it's very, very different thing.
Mm, mm. So there can be those differences, and I suppose there's something about sometimes uh, children who may be on the spectrum can get very good at compensating and mimicking and
Yeah,
and learning the kind of almost like rote learning phrases and comments and facial expressions that fit
yeah.
with everybody. So
And
it
I
is a
think
different.
particularly with girls, because very often, and in our society, it's okay for a girl to be quiet and shy as well. Not that my daughter's shy, but quiet and being at the back. And of course, if you're at the back, it's kind of
Yeah,
like when you start a new job, you're job shadowing. Well, for her, she job shadowed at school for years.
yeah,
You know, so therefore, you pick up certain things. It might not come naturally, but you learn what other people do. You learn how to start a conversation. You learn how to end one, and you also learn something called discernment when you learn that in the middle of a conversation somebody might not want you to spend 4 hours talking about ants or ladybirds or
yeah,
barbecuing, for example, and
yes,
you learn that people's eyes are starting to glaze over and they want the ground to swallow them up, and you learn that. It may not come naturally, but you learn it. You learn that otherwise people are going to yawn or walk off or whatever. So you learn to rein some of your behaviours in,
that,
and some of it's self-preservation because you don't want to be bullied at school either. So you have to
yeah,
think, maybe I'll
yeah,
shut up then, right? But then it can cause another problem where you self-isolate, and so you've got to think of a way of controlling that. So it's like behind me, you've got lots of Daleks and other Doctor Who stuff. Now,
yes,
I'm sure if you got several hours, I could spend hours talking about each one and all these sorts, which story they're from, and all that. And even if you're interested in Doctor Who, you'd have to be really, really interested in that because you always want to glaze over after the first 2 hours, or possibly even the first 2 minutes. And sometimes people are autistic; they have these special interests,
uh-huh,
but they're not aware that sometimes that other people might not share that special interest,
sure.
or even have a special interest of their own that's not that intense. They can move
Mm,
on from. So it's a
mm,
and so then they can mask that across. Oh, he's really eloquent. He can stand in front of a room and talk about autism, for example. So he can't have that much of a socialist. Yes, but I'm talking about something I'm familiar with. If
uh-huh,
I just stand up and talk about, I don't know, football, I could say what I think of England's last performance against San Marino, for example.
yeah,
But that would be 2 minutes if that. I couldn't
yeah,
spend 2 hours talking about it like the pundits on Match of the Day. It's
yeah,
very, very different. You're talking about something you really know, then you're confident, aren't you? And if you're talking about your own experience, then it's,
yeah,
as long as it has a bit of structure so you don't lose people, you can. It's more
yes,
comfortable feeling, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. This is it, and what I found is that when I'm with people who may have a diagnosis of autism or are seeking one, uh, very often they may bring the subject onto their area of interest and can talk very eloquently in a great lot of detail about it. David, in terms of where do you stand in terms of how society accepts people who are neurodiverse? Do we, for example, there's reports, aren't there, that people on the autism spectrum are much more likely to be medicated for all sorts of,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
associated difficulties. Um, you know, maybe even more likely to be institutionalized in the older days, and maybe even to a degree now.
yeah, yeah.
What's your thinking about that? How good are we at the moment at embracing
Um,
neurodiversity?
well, certainly we're on the right road. I mean, I would be wrong to say we're not, but
Mm,
there is still quite a way to go. And I think now, with things like the Christine McGuinness being in the news at the last night, of a program, and husband Paddy about their three children and her diagnosis, and also Mel Sykes and other people like that have come out, as it were, as
yeah.
being autistic. It's kind of like when more and more people came out as being gay, it became less of a taboo, and I think that's happening a
Mm,
bit with autism. And also over recent years, even some people that are more classic autists, even people that can't even speak,
Yes.
if they're able to read and write and able to describe their feelings, like the book The Reason I Jump, for example, is written by a Japanese lad that's autistic and non-verbal, but he's
Yes.
able to explain what's going on in here.
Hmm.
And sometimes people that are autistic can't always even do that, but sometimes if it's written down, they can do it a different way as well. So sometimes and that helps. So I think we need to move away from awareness now and more to acceptance and how do we change things. Um,
Right.
I
Right.
was part of the trial for the Oliver McGowan mandatory training, which is currently being reviewed, ready for rollout, hopefully next year. And that's because a young lad that had autism and had seizures, the medical team at the local hospital couldn't really understand his autism or his epilepsy, and we couldn't understand how his behaviour and being in hospital because of the sensory difficulties and environment. He was getting increasingly agitated, so they
Yeah.
medicated him and gave him antipsychotics, which he didn't need, which actually made his epilepsy worse. And then he was accused of
Yeah.
faking his seizures and lots of things. He ended up dying. But his
Mm.
mum, rather than penalising the hospital and having a fight against the NHS, hers is more awareness and acceptance that these
Mm.
sort of tragedies don't happen again,
Hmm.
or that they're reduced as much as possible. And I think that's I think that's a much more positive way to go, because you cannot change the past. You have to move forward and think. And it's good to mention about the institutions. There's a report just this week. There's about 2,000 people with autism or learning disabilities that are still in asylums in the UK, which is staggering. Some have been
It
in
is.
there for 20 years. And the problem that a lot of autistic people do, even people like myself, that are what you say, the higher end of the spectrum, is because they feel increasingly isolated. They may have issues with depression and anxiety. We
Yes.
ask for help. If we end up being over medicated or institutionalized, then it becomes major issues because you're in an environment that you find very difficult. So you react against that
That's right.
environment with challenging behaviours, and what
Yes.
becomes a voluntary admission can quite easily then become a section, which will then become months, even years, when all they needed to be was in the right environment in order to help that person self-manage their behaviours and their anxieties, and other people
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
life a bit easier. And
Absolutely.
some of the advice that we're given as part of this training was quite basic. It's sort of like, before your doctor places their hands on someone that's autistic, explain what they're doing, form the hands up, run together. The simple thing, and it's not, people think very complicated answers, and sometimes the answers are quite simple. Now, how would you feel if you weren't autistic and somebody
Mm.
put their freezing cold hands on you? You'd go, oh, you'd react, wouldn't you? Well, if you don't know how to react appropriately to that, socially appropriately, then you may hit them because you think, oh,
Yeah.
that's terrible. You put that freezing
Yes.
cold
Yeah.
hand on, get off me.
Yeah.
So it's a normal response, really.
Yeah.
It may be maybe slightly exaggerated, but then I find ways of dealing with
Yeah.
that. So it's about improving those things. It may take a generation, but I think things will start happening, and
Yeah.
that's the way to go forward. And which is why, like I said at the start, it's good that we talk about terminology, but these are the issues that really concern me as an autistic person and a self-advocate for my daughter and my son going
Yeah.
forward, and for the next generation of children going through, is that, yeah, terminology may change, but abuse needs to go, and
Yeah.
acceptance needs to be there.
So I know that in school settings nowadays, special educational needs coordinators, mental health first aid professionals, there's a lot more uh, awareness, as you say, David. So
Yeah,
people know what to look out for, and even professionals that may not be trained to work with autism or assess
yeah,
autism, because they've come across children over the years, that they see the signs and know the signs. But there's still quite a bottleneck in terms of being able to get through to a team that can help you with a diagnosis. What
yeah.
would you advise people who are struggling to
I
get an
well,
assessment?
I mean, I'm a sort of person that can't, obviously, I'm no clinician, so I couldn't do, psychologist, so I couldn't do a diagnosis. But I think, but the important thing from a diagnostic point of view is assessing someone's needs, where they are on the spectrum, what their needs are. And yes, it may not be the best thing to approach a doctor with this sort of thing, but maybe if you do, you can do assessments online, checklists that say, well, how you like a sensory profile. And I think for anybody autistic and not, particularly people that may be autistic, is a good thing, because then you
Yeah.
can say, well, that is why I don't like going to the doctors. It may not be anything to do with the medical thing. It could be I don't like whitewash
Mm.
rules, or
Mm.
in my daughter's case, she didn't mind that. She didn't like
Mm.
going to hospital if it was a children's ward because there was too many, no,
Mm.
too child friendly. And again, these are
Yeah.
sort of things that that not only would it help the people looking for a diagnosis, it may explain well there's certain things you can do while you wait for a diagnosis. You can think, what can I do to make my child's life easier? Or as an adult, what can I do to make my life easier?
Yeah.
What is it that I find work hardest about socialising? Is it the conversation, or is it I don't like crowded places? Well, in which case, if you find crowded places difficult, if you and you like the cinema, if you can, go on a weekday morning. You're
Yes.
still able to do the things you want to do, but it's quieter.
Yes.
Go at autism friendly screening, and you don't have to have a diagnosis of autism to go to autism friendly screening. It just means that you'll be going to a screening in the cinema where your
Yeah.
kids are allowed to chew loudly or allowed to get up on the seats if they want to, so which you couldn't do normally without being thrown out. So there's things you can do that will
Yes.
help your child that, without disabling them in any way, or without maybe pediatricians or teachers thinking you're trying to
Yeah.
disable your child, or whatever. So
Yeah.
so
Yes.
think of ways that you can help the child, and if
Yeah.
and I'd always say to people, if in doubt, I'll say four letters: CIBA. Could it
Mm-hmm.
be autism? And
Okay.
that works a lot of things. Now, if you see a 2-year-old laying on the floor, screaming their head off in Asda or Sainsbury's, oh
Yeah.
bless. 5-year-old doing that, you don't think, oh bless. The instant reaction is parenting. But then
Yes.
think, is it bad parent? Is that child being a little toe rag, or could it be autism? And if you
Yes.
think there's a reason for that behaviour, then then that changes your mindset to how you
Yeah.
approach things, doesn't it?
Well, the key
So
is not to judge anyway, isn't it?
it is,
Really,
yeah,
we judge far too readily, David, and I think we should always look with a compassionate mind and compassionate eyes. I feel, because people are often doing the best they can in difficult situations and circumstances. But I have seen now that some supermarkets are having autism friendly hours and so on, so that you can go, the lights are dimmed down, the music is quietened
yeah,
down,
yeah,
they're not blasting out the fragrances, that they do to get you
yeah,
to buy. So I think they're small steps, but we are starting to become a slightly more inclusive society, and long may that continue. And I think when we've got advocates like yourself, David, who have studied autism but know it firsthand through your experience of being diagnosed, this is what we need: people like yourself who can stand up and be advocates. Because sometimes it's ignorance, isn't it? Any sort of prejudice
it is, and
is.
also for parents as well, you need to find a way of desensitizing the children a little bit. Now, for example, if
Yeah.
they always, um, for want of a better word, not PC, but if they kick off when they take you to a restaurant, don't think they're never going to take you to a restaurant again. Think of going when it's quiet. Think of going
Yeah.
somewhere, ordering the meal even beforehand, and literally
Mm.
going there, dice table at the corner, book a table, go there, take the food, and go out. No, there's no waiting, so the anxieties went up. You're in a quiet corner. So all those things. So you're gradually introducing them to the concept of socialising, but in a way
Yeah.
that is less threatening. If you go to a
Yeah.
party, get there early so it gradually fills up, rather than you
Lovely.
arrive when it's full swing and it's like a rugby scrum when you first arrive.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of little things you can do, whether they've been diagnosed with autism or not, which will help any child or any young adult, rather than wait until they're adults and then try to do certain things, because some things then become ingrained as well, autism or not, and it can be very, very hard then to change those perceptions and those feelings.
Absolutely. Lovely tips, David. David, as we sort of close up, I'm aware that we've gone over our usual sort of half an hour, but it's been so interesting that I wanted to keep talking to you. But in terms of things you've read, books, websites, is there anywhere that you would direct people, who want to know more, want to learn more? I don't want to put you on the spot with that,
No,
but
absolutely fine. I'm quite free to talk about my own experience, or deliver training, or speaking, or signposting, or even one-to-one
yeah,
conversations with people, or small groups. Via my website, which, as you say, you've got on the screen there,
yeah, Wired
Wired
for
for Autism,
Autism.
wiredforautism.co.uk. A great
Mm,
source of information if you're just starting out on that journey, and you want a little bit of advice. Um, is the National Autistic Society. I mean, unfortunately, their helpline is now closed, but they do have quite a lot of things online, and also they have a directory locally in which, like myself and other people, would be on. So if you're in Northamptonshire, you'd find me, for example, if you're looking for autism providers, and that would be quite useful if you think, well, there's nobody in my area. And I know during the lockdown, I had quite a few phone calls from people all over UK, Wales, Yorkshire, a phone call from Devon, somebody saying, well, our local service, nobody's answering the phone because of COVID. Where do we go? But I knew where to Google search.
yes.
So, but it's sometimes known where people can go, and a little bit of signposting. I'm easy to do that. And as a
Yeah,
one-man band, sometimes it's easier because my phone's always on, and if I can't answer
yeah,
someone straight away, I will get back to them. And so that's another source in case my phone number's on the website, so I'm a mobile phone, which is quite useful as well. So
yeah,
so it's little things like that, sometimes people just want someone to talk to, just to sort of offload and think, well, as I said, the could it be autism word, and they're just saying, what do you think, or how do you go about this, or how do we
yeah.
get my husband diagnosed? Because it's a slightly different process for adults, because obviously you don't involve education or educational psychology, it's slightly different. And
Yeah,
those sort of things. And I always say to people, say, if in doubt, well, I would always say to people, it's a good thing to go for a diagnosis, because um, everybody needs to understand themselves. And it's an old adage from, I know, the song, the greatest love of all is to love yourself before you can love anybody. And there's a lot of truth in that. If you can understand yourself, and you can then understand why certain behaviours, I'm happily married after 25 years, I can now understand why certain of my behaviours are habits really annoy my wife. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to stop doing some of them, but I can do them. I can maybe say, well, it's like little things like on my massive collection down here.
yeah,
Now, and there was a time when I gradually building that up in the living room, and one day my wife had a friend come to visit and said, "Oh, it's really really interesting, but is there anything of your wife in this room?" and it made me think, and it wasn't I've been selfish. It looked quite good, and I think, yeah, but and even people that were complimenting on it were saying the same thing. It said, well, and then they realised, I'm not a bachelor anymore. I haven't been a bachelor for over 25 years. Why am I still doing this? And it makes you think. But if you know why you're doing that, why you have a compulsion to do certain things, these special
yeah,
interests, and again, they bring comfort to someone that's autistic. Kind of like, whatever you're interested in, if it's science fiction, if it's sport, if it's trains or whatever, you know, even though in sport might be a certain amount of unpredictability about it, but there is a certain predictability about certain things, and you can, and it's a sense of belonging, isn't it?
yeah.
You may find crowds really difficult, but if you're autistic and really like football, you might be able to cope going to a football ground
Sure.
because you're all doing the same thing. Yes, it's noisy, but you know it's going to be noisy. And again, if you get there early, that noise builds up. It doesn't start noisy, so it's kind of, so there are ways of even things like that. And
Yeah,
you were saying
yeah,
how things can improve. On that very subject, a friend of a relative of my wife's actually messaged me the other day to say that at Arsenal Football Club they
yeah.
actually have a sensory room
Oh
for,
wow.
for, for autistic kids. If they go to the football match, they're really into that, gets too much. So they can still watch the game if they want that live experience, but they've got an area where they can just relax if it gets too much. And I thought, I'm obviously not every football club can do that, but I thought, how forward thinking.
Lovely.
And they've obviously got the funds for it, because Premier League, mega bucks. But the fact they're even considering that is a
It's one.
massive step forward, isn't it?
It
You know,
is. It's.
and I was thinking, well, why don't they shout that from the rooftops? I would. It's good PR as well as anything else. And I thought,
I've
that's a
never heard it
brilliant idea.
before, and they ought to be promoting it and as a model of good practice. It's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. And I
Wonderful.
thought, oh, really, really good. And I thought, so, and again, it's simple. It's those little measures. So you're also saying to that person, or even if that kid's spending the whole day there, they can in effect the whole family go to the football. The dad can go and watch his football. The football can, the brother or sister that's an Arsenal fan can go and do that. And
Yeah.
he's not excluded. He's
Sure.
still getting the atmosphere, but he's getting it in a safe way. You know, it's the next best thing, isn't it? Going to, watching a game live with a few people is in a
Yeah.
pub is almost as good as going to the real thing. Not quite, but you still get a bit of atmosphere. So they're getting a bit of atmosphere of being there, but they're
Mm.
not getting all the stress side of it as well. And I thought, how how forward thinking is somebody to think about? And it's
Absolutely.
those little things that again, the more it's done, the more it becomes not only just acceptable, but more normal. It become mainstream, won't it? It's kind of like the more and more, particularly women that talk about being diagnosed, the more girls will be diagnosed inevitably.
Yeah.
And the more people realise, and we haven't really discussed it much today, the benefits of being autistic can be that attention to
I,
detail, that fact that you go to work, you don't just go to work to socialise and work's a second, or because you have to, because you've got to earn the money. You find someone's interest if they're autistic. Doesn't matter what it is, use it. There
yeah.
was a lad many years ago, supported by the National Autistic Society in Leicester, that always wanted to be an astronaut. And at school they said,
Yeah.
well, you're never going to be an astronaut, and shut him down. But some forward-thinking support worker said, well, we've got a space centre in Leicester. Do a bit of voluntary work there, and now he gets paid as a guide there.
Yes.
And you can talk about space because it's the thing he knows about. So he's really comfortable talking about this, and even if they ask questions, he knows all the answers.
It is
So,
stuff.
so,
Yeah.
to, so to all intents and purposes, he's been, if you think of autism as disability, he's being enabled by that
Yes.
environment rather than being disabled by work by saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, it's very, very difficult. And
Yeah.
who better? It's like at school, who are the best teachers? Not necessarily the ones that are the most academic, the most brilliant, but the ones that bring a subject to life. These are the ones that, it's like, I'm sure for yourself, when you were doing your psychology, the best psychologists weren't the ones who necessarily have written a million books, but the ones who brought that to life, who used these great anecdotes and really explained it in a way that you really, I understand. This is why I want to do it.
Yeah.
These are the people that inspire
Yeah.
creativity,
And
and that's what
I've
you need.
experienced that. I'm glad you raised it, David. The strengths and the capabilities when I work with families or with adults who may get a diagnosis. One of the things I often say to them is that, look, we can. This is sometimes described as a syndrome or a disability, but actually, there are some real strengths if we can harness them. And the number, I'm talking stereotypes probably here, but I've seen many people on the spectrum who are actually engineers,
Yeah,
mathematicians, computer programmers. Uh, you know, the FBI employs people who are on the
yeah,
autism spectrum because nobody can break down a system or see patterns better than
yeah,
somebody who has that sort of brain power. That sort of neural.
yeah. And it's because they take less interest in the social the flat, all the dressing.
Yeah,
That they can concentrate purely on what they do.
yeah,
It's not, and obviously some people are autistic are geniuses. Well, a lot of people aren't necessarily geniuses, but they're so narrow, they're narrow focused enough that the rest of the thing, they're not. When I was working for the benefits agency many years ago, which then became Job Centre Plus, I was able to produce more work than my colleagues, which didn't always endear me with them because I always hit my targets. But I could be next to a phone that's ringing and not even be aware. And they used to say, "Oh, your desk is really tidy. I don't like an untidy desk." I said, "Get some else work done." Does it matter? But
no,
I couldn't explain it. I could have three different. I could have someone could phone up and I could get their paperwork out, get somebody else's paperwork out, and still get everything done. But yes, it looked a mess. As long as it's tidy by the end of the day, did it really matter? Every
Yeah.
time as if you're like that and you can't find anything. It's a bit like, so in many ways, I was probably like the Sherlock Holmes of the local, you know, what and again, you think, and again in that job, it's a very logical thing. There are certain things you can do. You know that someone that's got no money coming in, that did have redundancy money, is going to be the first person to scream for money. So you go
Yeah.
to work early, you pay them. Then on the
Yes.
phone, wanting the counter payment for these are the counter payments. Well, it's already gone, sorted. So there. So by thinking logically, you can get more work done, and so again,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that makes life a little easier as well. So and not everybody gets that, and sometimes it's a bit like the Greta Thunberg, with whatever you think of her as a person.
Yeah.
It's taken a teenage autistic schoolgirl from
There
Sweden
you go.
to
Yeah.
really bring climate change to the fore
Yeah.
in a way that I know people like Duke of Edinburgh and Prince Charles have mentioned it 40 years ago, it but nobody was really galvanising everybody together.
Yeah.
For right or wrong, she did that. Even people didn't look critical of her. Well, she got the subject. Every time she spoke, people listened because she was news.
That's right.
More
She's
than it, regardless. And it's that enthusiasm of the young that's going to carry
yeah.
things forward. But you'd look at her and think, yeah, I'm not she's autistic, but how can she stand in front of a crowd and talk about that? But if you're
Uh,
passionate, nerves go.
that's
Don't know,
right.
because you're so passionate what you're talking about, and you know your
Yeah.
subject, and
Yeah.
all those sensory difficulties fly out the window because
Yeah.
because you've got a story you really desperately want to
Mm,
tell,
mm,
and that
mm.
overrides all those anxieties. So if you find the right outlet for a person that's autistic,
Yeah.
they can thrive. Or if they can't thrive, they can certainly um, cope with society in a better way rather than
Yeah.
be left behind. And it's so sad. There's so many people who've got such great gifts that can't find employment because they're autism. I've met people who've got PhDs even that can't find a work because I'm struggling maybe a little bit tonight. That aren't perfect at interviews, aren't perfect at application forms,
Cool.
or not a team player. Well, some jobs you
Yes.
don't necessarily have to be a team player. If you're researching that person's really good at typing everything up, does he have to
Yeah.
be a team player? Give him
Yeah.
something to do. If he can do that, get him to copyright everything, whatever, proofread. They're still doing his part, and he'll get stuff done. It doesn't
Yes.
matter, does it?
It
And
doesn't.
I think lockdown has proved that you can do some work at home anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No,
we need to
David,
utilise those skills more.
it's it's been really wonderful, David. I'm going to just pause you for a moment, and then we'll say our goodbyes to our audience and people
Thank
that
you.
will be listening at other times. But thank you for the moment. Just hold on there for me, though. I just wanted to say to everybody that's tuning in and will be watching over the coming weeks and months, thank you for giving us your time. This has been a free event about autism. I've been talking with David Crisp, who's a national autism assessor, has Asperger's syndrome, autism himself, a diagnosis that he had at the age of 42. It's been a very revealing and interesting interview and conversation, really, I should say. Here at Solihull Wellbeing Clinic, we do have a very wide range of practitioners, educational psychologists, nurse practitioners, autism experts, people that can do specialist assessments with children and adults, psychiatry also. So we use a multidisciplinary assessment process, psychology, and also specialist nursing, and we use the ADOS 2 for young people, which is a gold standard in assessment. So if you are struggling to find somewhere to, get a diagnosis, get an assessment, not just for autism, but any other condition, or you want to look at autism or your child or your young person in the wider realm of things, we can certainly help if you would like to contact us. Today has been a well-being conversation with David Crisp. We do try to run these each Thursday. So if you're interested, you have expertise, you know someone that would like to talk on a subject, do ask them to get in touch. They can get in touch with us through Facebook or through Twitter, or indeed through our website, www.solihullwellbeingclinic.com. And if you want to get in touch with David, David's website is wiredforautism.co.uk. You're more than welcome to contact David. So I'm going to just bring David in so we can say our farewells. David, thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Bobby. It always is.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll see you again, David. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
And I cut David off very abruptly there. I do apologise, David. I'm still getting used to this lovely system that we have here. Restream is what I've been using today. So thank you, and do look out for us in future. Bye bye now.